Now, earlier this month, the second ordinary session of the third Pan-African Parliament opened, and with it, the launch of an important campaign to promote media freedom on the continent. We were joined earlier by Professor Kwame Karikari, who's director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. He explains the broad rationale. The launch of the Pan-African Parliament campaign to promote media freedom in Africa. To what extent is this concept under threat? Looking through the tomes of literature that there is on this, one's getting a sense that there is room for optimism, that perhaps, in spite of many difficulties, things on this front are starting to improve.
Well, things were starting to improve a few years ago, but the situation is a bit dim nowadays. First of all, major reforms have not been going on the continent. There are just about a couple of countries where you can say that certain new laws have been passed that open up the space. Otherwise, things in fact seem to be rolling back from the 90s when there was such a big opening and everybody thought that, now here we are, now Africa is going to be really a space of freedom of expression.
Is there a single reason for this?
There are a number of reasons. Some political, some just cultural, and some just plain power of people in politics. And some also, people in politics are fearing more and more that perhaps the people are getting too free. People are able to say so many things. And I think the culture of governments, ruling classes, tolerating diverse viewpoints, it's not strong enough. Once people also get a sense that they are in power, they tend to feel that we must consolidate that power and to rule for as long and as much as we want and in any way. So the more freedoms people have to criticize them, to ask questions, the more fearful they get.
And the consequence of that information shutdown, I think, is fairly obvious, isn't it?
Yes, too many countries, too many things are kept in the dark. And so that also breeds conspiracies. That also breeds all manner of attitudes among the population and among opposition forces that are not in the end going to be good for democracy. If the openness was wide and continued, then people express themselves and conspiracies are lessened and fear is lessened, and so governments can rule freely, the citizens can act freely, and I believe there would be more progress for everybody.
And this isn't just something that is happening in the newsrooms and perhaps in the courts and maybe in the halls of power. You also make the point that the continent remains dangerous to work in, that there's a strategy almost of beating journalists to a pulp, I think somebody said. It's become more difficult to report the story.
It is becoming more difficult to report the story, but not just that, it's becoming difficult in one corner of the continent. The trend is beginning to be more infectious all over. Even in countries where 5-10 years ago, you realize that, here we come, now this is freedom, they are closing up, and that's dangerous. And it's getting dangerous not because terrorism is growing, but because people have been in power. Power is sweet, and then they think they must now, close the space for people showing the ugly part of the way they govern.
To that end, something called the Midrand Declaration has been signed. What does that entail, and what do you hope to achieve?
The idea is to promote more openness, to, for instance, promote more legislation that free up the space. The idea is to also cut back on the encroachments on freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and to decriminalize, the space for freedoms. You see that where in countries where we thought they were citadels of freedom, question marks are beginning to pop up about whether or not these freedoms would be maintained and expanded. And you find governments beginning to resort to using criminal legislation to clamp down on free speech, and that's not very good.
This declaration is grand, it's sweeping in its intention, but it's going to remain just that, something on paper, unless there is a will to live by it and also to enforce it. I'd suggest to you that that is a long way off, if the current environment remains as negative as you've suggested.
People have to fight for freedoms. The purpose of the declaration and such activities are to alert the populations, not just the governments, but to alert the populations that, look, you must consistently and constantly defend and fight for your freedom. Just because a law has been passed does not give you the freedom. You must assert it. You must take it up. You must fight for it and ensure that every day that law is respected. A declaration doesn't bind any government, any authority. But if a government appends their signature to a declaration, it's an intent. And so citizens must take it up that, if you intend to do this, let's see how we can translate it in local legislation and then in practice. You know, that's why it's important that people are always organized around issues of freedom.
Coming up on the programme, how the media can play a role in combating child abuse and how a 150-year-old baking brand went big on Mother's Day.
News that moves. ENCA.com.